Hello and welcome to the Simple Faith Podcast. My name is Dave Betts and I'm here with my wife Sharaya as we explore all the things that make our faith what it is. What that means is that we're looking at authentic Christianity for normal people, or in other words, we're trying to strip out all the unnecessarily churchy or intellectual words and focus on exploring just real life, down to earth faith. So like I said, my wife Sharaya is here. You've been away for most of the episodes so far, but you're back for now, which is an awesome thing. So how come you were gone?
I was gone because we had a baby. His name is Joshua Joseph. We call him JJ, and he's the sweetest little guy, but he needs a lot of attention. So that was what I was doing. I was just taking care of him while Dave did podcasts with other incredible guests.
Yeah, we're still very much trying to figure out what this looks like. So Sharaya is going to be around for the next 3 episodes, which we're recording in one day right now, while Sharaya's mum is babysitting for us. And then we might take another break for Sharaya until we're able to figure out a bit more of a regular routine. But Sharaya, it's really good to have you back, especially for this really intense episode. We're talking about suffering over this episode and the next episode. Sharaya, I think with JJ, I think you can say that you experienced a little bit of suffering, didn't you?
It's hard to, having a baby it's hard. It's really hard. And the pain of childbirth is definitely intense. I'm terrified to go through that again. But obviously it was worth it because we have a beautiful baby boy. But it in a way, it does feel like suffering because it was such intense pain. But I mean, it's crazy. So many women go through it every single day. It's just like normal.
Yeah, I've said it before, but I'll say it again. If you are a parent and you've been through childbirth, wow. Even as you're figuring out what life as a parent is like, yeah, we so appreciate you. Yeah. Well done. We are very much getting by the skin of our teeth, trying to figure out what it looks like to be parents. This is a huge topic that we're talking about. And so I think as we approach the topic of suffering, I think what we're going to do is we're going to split it into 2 parts. We like to kind of build cases. If you've watched this show or listened to this show for any length of time, we like to build cases. So in this first episode, we're going to begin building a case by looking at the reality of the problem of suffering. And then in the next week's episode, we're going to work our way towards maybe finding an answer, at least some part of an answer towards the problem of suffering. So we're not going to promise that we have all the answers. We will do our best. This is going to get probably tough and messy, and we're at the beginning of a series that we're calling Tough Conversations. So we're going to have 2 discussions around suffering. Then we're going to talk about depression, and then we're going to talk about grief. So it's not going to be an easy few weeks, but we don't want to shy away from those difficult questions just because they're difficult. So with all that said, let's have a quick break, and then we'll jump into the reality of suffering. So let's go. So Sharaya, let's talk about suffering. You know, there is a reality that there is evil and there is suffering in the world. And that's a real challenge for us, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, for myself, I feel like I haven't really suffered in my life like many people do. So it's hard. It's hard to talk about and hard to totally get your mind around, I think. But I think it's important to talk about for sure. So
yeah, I mean, here are some realities. There is evil in the world. What we need to be careful of doing, and if you're listening at home, what we need to be careful of doing is painting it all with one brush. So not all evil and not all suffering is the same. You know, we have natural evil. So that's things like natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, famines, and all those kinds of things. Famine's an interesting one. Let me jump back to that in just a second. And then we have moral evil. So that's evil committed by humans. So like murder, rape, deception, coercion, all those kinds of things. So we have natural evil and then we have moral evil. Now, famine's an interesting one. I just want to throw this out there. Famine is natural evil, but at what point does it become moral evil? You know, if we have an opportunity to stop people from starving and we choose not to do anything, is that a moral evil or is that natural evil? It's natural evil that becomes moral evil. So we need to separate those 2 things because our response to natural evil is not the same as our response to moral evil. And we'll talk about that more next week. So we recognize that there are those 2 things and they cause suffering. And as we talked about, Sharaya, that suffering is just a reality in our world. You know, I've got a few stories I want to share, but I wonder if you've encountered suffering if not in your own life, in the lives of others?
Yeah, well, I mean, we talked about childbirth. I think that for me was probably the closest to like physical suffering that I've come to. But I think, I mean, there's so many testimonies of people who have suffered and have suffered and still maintain this incredible relationship with Jesus and have an incredible hope through it. And so I think that's where, yeah, like that's what I find incredible. And I mean, you even see it in the Bible, like Paul, he suffered intensely, and yet he was like, I have amazing hope and I have amazing joy and peace, even though I've suffered.
Yeah, I think the reality is we're going to get to that bit.
Oh, okay.
But
Yeah.
let's talk about the suffering itself. You know, so I know in my life, I've gone through periods where I've been suicidal. I've talked about that on this show. As a teenager, that was a long time ago. But I've also experienced people treating me in ways that are pretty nasty, and I felt the suffering of that. But yeah, in the scheme of things, it doesn't feel like a huge amount of suffering. Some of the things that stand out for me is like when I went to India in 2013 or so. I remember we're sightseeing and we're doing all this fun stuff as we get to look at these amazing Indian buildings, and we get to explore the Indian culture. And I remember this, she couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 years old, this girl that came up to us, just raggedy clothes. She looked so filthy, looked like she'd never washed in her life. She had like flies crawling around her face, and my heart broke. And you realize that this poor little girl, like, what has she done to deserve that? Why is she born into this life? And, you know, in India, there's the kind of the remnants of this caste system. And I wouldn't be the right person to talk about the in-depth reality of the caste system, but apart from the fact that it was there, and if you're part of the lowest class, you're considered nothing. Now, why would you be born into a society where you are treated as nothing? That's brutal. I mean, of course, we could talk about the Holocaust and the amount of suffering that was caused there by humans. And the other thing that stands out to me was when I went to Kenya. And I remember being 17 years old in Kenya in this bus. And the minute we would stop, hands would just reach into the windows of this bus because they were desperate for money. And I remember getting off the bus and seeing this, again, little boy, probably 8 or 9. And he was addicted to glue sniffing. That was the thing in Kenya at the time. He was so addicted to glue sniffing that he wanted money to go and feed his habit as like an 8-year-old kid. And that's heartbreaking. You know, so there is a reality that suffering happens. So we have, you know, natural evil and we have moral evil, and these things cause suffering. So we know that suffering is a reality, and it's not easy. You think about the tsunami in 2004. Maybe you remember it, maybe you don't. You might be a bit too young, but I was about 15 when that happened. And I remember hundreds of thousands of people dying. And actually, I had a friend who was, I think, in Singapore at the time. I forget. I didn't really care where they were, but I knew that they were in the area. And suddenly you're like, are they okay? And thousands and thousands and thousands of people died because of a tsunami. So we recognize there is suffering, and it causes pain. And it's the result of evil, some natural, some moral. And this is a huge challenge. So if we were building a case, we'd say, yes, there is evil in the world. We need to categorize it into natural and moral evil, but this causes suffering. And actually, this is a huge challenge for lots of people. You know, I know in my life, and probably Sharaya in your life, probably people we both know since, you know, we are married, there are people that have really struggled with this concept of suffering. How could God allow suffering, right?
Yeah, it's such a tough question. And I know I watched a video the other day, and it showed this orphanage of these abandoned babies just crammed into this room, like just crying, screaming, and there wasn't enough people to take care of them. They had no parents, and oh, my heart just broke, especially after having JJ. Like, it was heartbreaking to see that. And yeah, you wonder, like, why does that happen? Why is that allowed to happen?
Yeah, it's a hard thing. So what we're not trying to do is underplay the reality of suffering. We recognize that it's a huge thing. It's a huge challenge. It's a huge struggle for many people. Maybe for you listening at home, you might think, oh, this really causes me to question God. In fact, I want to point us to one of the oldest arguments against God because of this. A guy called Epicurus, who was a philosopher from I think the 3rd or 4th century. He says that if God is all powerful and all loving, then how does evil exist? Why does evil and suffering exist? So his argument kind of goes like this. If God is all powerful and he allows suffering to happen, then he's not all loving. Or if God is all loving and there is still evil and suffering in the world, then he's not all powerful. So essentially they're saying, well, how can God exist with all this evil in the world if he's, as the Bible says he is, and we believe he is, all powerful and all loving? That's a really good argument. And again, we're going to try and answer that later in the conversation. And I believe there are some good answers to that. I think we can get to a good place in answering these good questions. But I think maybe we'll take a break here and then we'll continue to build more foundations in preparation, I should say, for the answers that we will do our best to give. Okay, so let's kind of do a quick recap and then we'll keep going again just so we keep track of where we're going. We're saying that there is evil in the world. There's moral evil and then there's natural evil. And that evil causes suffering, which, let's be real, is tough. And it causes many people to even question their faith. So we recognize that this is a big deal. And something I think we should add on and maybe camp out on a little bit is the fact that this whole topic of suffering is one that hasn't been helped by the way that Christians have responded. And how often is that the case when stuff that we're talking about in terms of theology and in terms of what the Bible teaches hasn't been helped by the response of people who would call themselves Christians? So this is another example. Let's talk about, say, Job. Job is someone who he experienced tremendous suffering. We'll probably talk about him more in the coming episodes. He experienced tremendous suffering, and then he had these 3 friends who started off responding really, really well, and then they responded really, really poorly. They started to say things like, "Oh, maybe it's just because you're sinful that you're experiencing suffering," and it's stuff like that. And you're like, "No, that's not it. That's not what the Bible teaches us at all." And I've been in situations where, let's say someone's suffering and needs to be healed, and someone said, "Oh, well, you're not being healed just because you don't have enough faith," or and we'll talk about that. We've got a whole series on healing coming up in, probably a couple of months now, but we're looking forward to that. But yeah, or if someone is grieving, you say, "Oh, well, cheer up. They've gone to a good place." That doesn't mean that you don't suffer just because what their destination and so on. I don't know, Sharaya, if you've experienced any of these things.
Yeah, well, I think I understand not always knowing how to respond to other people's suffering. Like that is hard. It's hard to know how to comfort people, but I think you're right. There's often a Christian response that's meant to kind of cheer someone up, but it's not actually helpful.
Yeah.
And I think we also need to recognize that.
Yeah, I mean, the Bible does say in 1 Thessalonians 5, it says, to be joyful always, pray continually, and give thanks in all circumstances. There's other places like Philippians 4:6 that says, don't be anxious, but with prayer and petition and thanksgiving, make your requests known to God. Matthew, I think 24 says again, don't be anxious. 1 Peter 4, it says, don't be anxious. There's a few places where it talks about not being anxious. And again, the sense of be joyful in the Lord. Well,
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, but you also see, David in Psalms and like he's crying out and like all these huge emotions of just pain and anxiety and sorrow that he feels. And you see that in the text. You equally see that he comes back to God and finds his hope in God. But yeah, you know that he's struggling and he expresses that.
Yeah. And that's something that I think is really important to talk about. Being joyful doesn't always mean being happy.
Yeah.
And sometimes we confuse that. And I wonder, I don't know if we've planned that, but I wonder if at some point we should do a discussion about what it means to be joyful in the Lord. Because it's hard to be joyful when your husband has just died or your child's been in a car accident, or the list goes on, and we're talking about suffering around the world. When those things happen, it's hard to be joyful. In John 9, the disciples ask Jesus, they say, well, what sin did this guy commit that he's suffering the way he is? And Jesus is like, no. Don't even worry about that. But we think in those terms, let's read that story again. Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. And that's in John chapter 9, verse 3. Jesus is saying, no, it's not the result of sin that you're suffering. And yet we somehow forget that, and that can be a real problem. In fact, the Bible does acknowledge that we will experience suffering. You've talked about this idea of lamenting, which we'll talk about more as we talk about depression and things like that as well. But there's also a few Bible verses that I want to read here. John 16:33 says this, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace, which is great. But it also says, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. So we can expect trouble. Yeah, Jesus is saying, hey, come on, you can have peace, but it doesn't mean you're not going to have trouble. James 1 verse 2 says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Now, the key thing is we are going to face trials. It's not like it doesn't say if you face trials of many kinds. It says whenever you face trials of many kinds. 1 Peter 1:6, it says, in all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. Again, recognizing that trials will come. 2 Corinthians 1:4 says this, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. So again, there's this acknowledgement from these key leaders in the church, as well as Jesus, saying, no, trouble will come. Sometimes we hear this prosperity gospel idea that is, oh, if you just have enough faith, if you just pray enough, you're going to be happy, healthy, and wealthy. And actually, that's not what we see in the Bible. We've talked about the lamenting. We see it in the Psalms. There's so many Psalms that just cry out saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's Jesus speaking. But we see that kind of that sense in the Psalms, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's so dangerous to say, that just because you're a Christian, you won't suffer, you won't have any hardships, or that life is going to be perfect. That's just not true. And that can such a dangerous thing to say to people, because then, when they do encounter suffering, then, that's going to affect their faith. And we've seen that in some cases, and that's really sad. But what is, exciting is that God promises to comfort us and to be there for us. And we know that God understands our situations when we do suffer, and we can go to him. So that's I think the hope that we have in it as well.
Yeah. So the scope of today is not to try and answer that question. What we want to do is recognize that, yes, there is suffering, and it's the result of evil in this world, and it's hard, and it causes us to question, and sometimes it rocks our faith to the very core. I think next week, we're really going to dig into this question and look at an intellectual answer, but also kind of an emotional answer as well. I think what we'd say to you today is that if you are someone that is experiencing suffering at the moment, we're so sorry. We're so sorry that you're going through what you're going through. We want to say that we recognize that. If you need to talk, we are here. Feel free to contact us at simplefaithpodcast@gmail.com, or connect with us on our social media accounts on Instagram or Facebook or whatever. We would love to connect with you in some way. If we can pray for you, that would be wonderful. Whatever we can do to help you. Maybe you're going through grief. Maybe you've lost a loved one. Maybe you've been through some kind of shock or trauma. Let's be real. We're in the COVID-19 world. This podcast started at the beginning of COVID-19, and we are now, approaching 45 episodes, and we're still in COVID. Maybe you're feeling that. Maybe you're suffering. Maybe you're struggling. We want to say that it's okay, and it's okay to cry out to God. It's okay if you're feeling it. Like Sharaya, I think Sharaya is very good at comforting people who are feeling the pain and the challenges of this life. I wonder, maybe you have something that you would say. What would you say to people who are struggling at the moment?
Yeah, that it's hard. It's really hard. And yeah, we don't want to minimize the pain that you would be feeling. But yeah, just that there's hope, and if you have people in your life that you can go to bring comfort or support, or just talk to, yeah, that's a great thing to do. And if you need to reach out to anyone, like Dave said, we're here. You can reach out to us, and we love to pray for you.
Yeah. So let's summarize what we've covered today. Again, I like to just remind ourselves where we've been, just so we don't forget as we work through these journeys together. Firstly, evil does exist. We'll talk about why and all that stuff in the next episode. There's natural evil, which basically refers to things like tsunamis and hurricanes and famines and things like that. And then there's moral evil, which is human evil, things that we do to other people, murder, rape, deception, all those kinds of things, coercion. So there's two types of evil. We have to separate those. That's really important. And they cause huge challenges for us. And that's okay. The Bible doesn't say that you have to be happy all the time. It says be joyful, and there's a difference. It's okay to question the injustice and the apparent unfairness of it all. It's okay to question those things and still see God as good and loving, and know that He is for you and with you and has plans and a purpose for you and all of that good stuff. And it's okay to feel a sense of sadness if you're going through a season of depression or shock or grief or all those things. So it's okay. We're with you. We recognize that this is a tough challenge. And in the next episode, if you can bear with us for a week, we're going to really dig into trying to actually answer the question of suffering. So we hope you found this episode really helpful. If you did enjoy it, feel free to rate it or to subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. And if you want to support us financially, you can do so by going to buymeacoffee.com/simplefaithpod. That's it from us. Have a fantastic week, and we will pick up this conversation in 7 days' time. See you very soon.